Hi there, my name is Laura Alston. I'm a historian and PhD student at the University of Sheffield, specialising in 18th century history, the history of emotions, microhistory, and in social and cultural history. And I'd like to thank you for coming to this talk today on incomers, hidden global connections in Sheffield General Cemetery. I'm going to share my screen now, so there we go. I'm also a heritage professional, and I'm currently working as the Activity and Engagement Officer on Sheffield City Council's heritage-funded, lottery-funded project at Sheffield General Cemetery. And I'd really like to thank Migration Matters for inviting me to speak as part of this fantastic digital festival. Please put any questions that you have in the chat as we go along, and we will answer as many of those as we can at the end of the talk. I'm here with Shirley Baxter, who's one of the researchers at Sheffield General Cemetery, and she's going to help me if I get anything wrong. So a little bit of background about the project that I'm working on. Sheffield City Council has been awarded funding from the National Lottery Heritage Fund and National Lottery Community Fund as part of a 4-year programme of repair, conservation and access improvements for Sheffield General Cemetery. The funding was granted to enable the conservation and interpretation of the cemetery's heritage, improvement of facilities, and a programme of activities and events. We want to create an accessible, safe and welcoming public park for everyone. And as part of this, I've been working on an activities programme of interpretation and events that's loosely structured around some identified themes for the heritage, landscape and biodiversity of the cemetery. And these themes are buried stories, which look at the hidden everyday lives of people buried in the cemetery, industrial connections, which explore all the big industrialists who are buried at the cemetery, but also the global industrial connections found there from people all over the world and for the trade from all over the world. And also people who just worked in the industry as well, who are buried at the cemetery. Radical Sheffield, which looks at history of activists and humanitarians, and all sorts of great political activists, like I said, who are also buried in the cemetery. Then we have a thread called Artists and Artistes, which is all about performers and theatre producers and actors and artists and circus producers who are also buried at the cemetery. And then finally, Transcendental Tales, and the cemetery landscape, which looks at nature and the landscape of the cemetery itself. And then finally, Transcendental Tales, which looks at the symbols and the myths and the legends which are woven into the cemetery and into the very architecture. So this project is also working really closely with Sheffield General Cemetery Trust. The Trust manage the buildings on the site, and they have a fantastic, rich selection of volunteers who do incredible work at the cemetery, maintain the landscape, but also doing burial research. So researchers at the cemetery piece together the lives of people buried there through tantalizing glimpses that remain in the archive and the burial records. And they've brought to life fascinating stories from all walks of life, from all over the world, who are buried in the cemetery. And these stories tell us so much about Sheffield's history in the 19th and 20th centuries. For much of the information that I'm going to tell you about today, I'm really indebted to the work of these history volunteers who have been researching these stories for years, especially to Jean Lees, Jo Meredith, Shirley Baxter, who's here, Jane Horton and Hilary Macara, who have been instrumental in helping me to learn more about the cemetery and educating me in the history and stories of the site, and also welcome me to do my own research into some of the hidden stories that are found there. Sheffield General Cemetery opened in 1836 and it had its last burial in 1978. And there are 87,000 burials on site. It became established as the principal burial ground in Victorian Sheffield. The site today is a Grade 2 star listed park, which is one of the highest listed in Sheffield and only one of 5 listed at Grade 2 star or Grade 1 in South Yorkshire. It's a conservation area, an area of natural history interest, and a local nature reserve. Amongst the graves is the largest single public grave plot in the country, holding the bodies of over 80 people. So we have a lot of public graves at the cemetery, and these were designated to those who couldn't afford to have a grave marker, couldn't afford a private grave. So when I talk about hidden history in this talk, this is partly about history that's literally hidden, that not just that it's not well known or needs to be put back into a narrative of Sheffield history. You know, these are burials, a lot of these are burials without markers, and we need to do research, lots of research, to piece lives and stories back together again and make these lives visible again. The people buried at the cemetery contain a huge variety of backgrounds, from important celebrity figures in Sheffield history, such as Mark Firth, the steel manufacturer, and Samuel Holbury, the chartist, to lots of more unknown everyday lives which populate our social and cultural history. All of these people have stories to tell. And this talk is focused on a selection of stories taken from the research into the lives of the people who are buried in the cemetery who came from all over the world. This research has been turned into a booklet called Incomers, written by Jean Lees of the Burial Research Team, to which I and Shirley Baxter have also contributed. Today at the cemetery, we look at the range of lives, perspectives, and experiences. Oh, I've gone along a bit. I'll come back. We look at the range of lives, perspectives, and experiences, and think about how they all work together to tell a bigger story, what they show about the history of the cemetery and the history of Sheffield. Social and cultural history, emotion history, and microhistory, the areas that I specialize in, they all rely on drawing out the different nuanced narratives of people's lives, reconstructing the minutiae of people's lives to truly understand the big picture of history. The burial research team look at individuals and reconstruct their lives in as much detail as they can. And through this reconstruction, we can learn so much more about different communities, individuals, heritage threads, experiences, and themes which have made Sheffield what it is today. I believe that in order to understand the big context of history, we have to put together and reconstruct the micro, the everyday lives that people lived. And people's stories build history. It's our everyday actions that really do build the chart of time. It's real people who are behind every movement and live through every big moment. And the cemetery is a place in which all the richness of those perspectives, all those lives can be found and reconstructed through a wide range of primary sources, from census records to property records to newspapers and pictures, that help us really understand the larger picture of history, to see how people lived, what families were like, what patterns emerged, what the social and cultural vista of 18th and 19th century Sheffield was, and how this history connects to a much bigger local, national, and international narrative, or narratives, plural. The 87,000 people buried at the cemetery all have stories to tell, and every one of us will be able to find connections in the wealth of human experience that they possess. The title of the booklet references not only the global connections of those who came to the city over these centuries, but also their relationship to how they made their income, especially in trade and industry in the city. Most of the big industrialists buried in the cemetery made their money from global trade. Mark Firth's guns, for example, were used in the French and English Imperial Navy, colonial navy. Cutlery made by John Nicholson and steel by Thomas Turton, both buried on site, were sent all over the world. Other stories, like those of the De Bell grave, show how imported materials such as Moroccan leather were being brought in, turned into goods like cap linings, and sent back across the world. Many people made their way into Sheffield to make an income because this was a place of opportunity, not just in industry, but in food, music, teaching, theatre, art, and culture. And this talk will tell a few stories from some of these incomers, who include pork butchers, a possible West African sailor, a circus proprietor, an actor, revolutionary soldiers, all of whose last resting place is Sheffield General Cemetery. These stories also represent different experiences of coming into Sheffield and into Sheffield industries as well, from those who sought asylum to those who took part in colonial and global trade routes set up for Sheffield goods across the world, to communities who established themselves in Sheffield, and those whose stories suggest experiences which occurred due to further colonial expansion in the wake of the transatlantic slave trade. Sheffield expanded really rapidly as the Industrial Revolution progressed. The population grew from over 45,000 in 1801 to over 135,000 people in 1851. And this talk will draw out some of the key themes from a lot of these stories, themes like community building, food, activism, asylum, theatre, and the impact of global and colonial trade expansion. The history of this expansion and the history of Sheffield are intertwined with the histories of many communities from around the world who came and established themselves here, making Sheffield their home. And it's these stories which have built Sheffield's history and provided its rich legacy, making the city the dynamic multicultural place it is today. It's really important that all the global strands which make up this global history of Sheffield are told and acknowledged to understand the dual heritage of the city and the site and how this all connects to the city today. We really hope that the Incomers booklet helps with this endeavour. So the first story I'm going to tell you from the booklet is the story of pork butchers and music halls. The research for the booklet showed that there was a really large cohort of families from Germany who were buried in the cemetery who came to Sheffield over the Victorian period. Agricultural depression and a series of crop failures in 1800s Europe meant that some Germans were looking for new opportunities in the UK. Important industrial trade links were already set up between Britain and Hanover. However, although there were many steel and cutlery manufacturers from Germany mentioned in Sheffield directories over the 1800s, including many Jewish artisans, clerks, and teachers, the biggest trade for this German community was in butchers' shops. Many of those who left Germany were farmers' sons who learned the skills of slaughtering and butchery, and they found a ready market in northern cities like Sheffield, where the growing population of factory workers who worked long hours wanted a convenient meal. So German pork pies, sausages, and rissoles became the forerunners of today's fast food like burgers and fish and chips in the city. Often men would come first and get established, and they then provided opportunities for other young Germans, often family members. German women also came to Sheffield to work in these newly established businesses. So running butchers and convenience food often then turned into running pubs and music halls. And the history of this community is deeply intertwined with Sheffield's lasting pub and theatre culture. So one of these entrepreneurs in the music hall was Louis Metzger, who's buried in N71, nonconformist side of the cemetery. So according to Stephen McLaren's in Sheffield Walkabout, Sheffield boasted more music halls than any city outside of London. Most were built in the 1850s and 1860s onto the backs of public houses. They were rough and ready. So Louis Metzger, whose name means butcher in German, was a naturalised British subject, and he was listed in the Sheffield Directory of 1879 as being a pork butcher with business premises on South Street. So I've got one photograph there of a different German butcher's shop from around the same period. You can see on the window very clearly it says pork pies. Louis ran the Gaiety Music Hall as well on West Bar, and I've put here on the map, you can see the triangle where Corporation Street is, and that's where the Gaiety Music Hall was, right on the corner. It was one of Britain's last half a dozen music halls where admission was 3p returnable in beer. So despite having private snugs for, unquote, disorderly entertainments with versatile dancing girls, Mr. Metzger also kept a select house which offered good, clean entertainment where your wife and family could enjoy elegance, safety, comfort, and respectability. So not only was Louis interested in pigs as a butcher, but Stephen McLaren also relates that Louis had a musical pig, which trod the boards of the Gaiety. Brian D. Hillaby's book, The Lost Theatres of Sheffield, relates that the pig was named Lucy, and it apparently trotted freely amongst the customers, who encouraged the poor animal with its liking for beer until it was completely inebriated. Louis also ran the Britannia, of which there is only now a wall that remains at the side of the Emergency Services Museum in West Bar. The Gaiety closed in 1895, and I've got an image on here which shows what an interior of a music hall might have looked like in the period. And you can see lots of families and round tables, and it would have been, heavy entertainment, really exciting entertainment. It appears that Louis married twice, the second time to his housekeeper, Sophia, and he had 8 children, not all of whom survived, and he died in 1924. And one of the totem poles at West Bar is to the Gaiety, well, not just the Gaiety, but to the music halls in Sheffield's past. And I've got an image of that there as well. Another really important theatrical connection to Sheffield is the circus. In 2018, Sheffield Museums ran the hugely popular Circus Show of Shows exhibition curated by Professor Vanessa Tallman. This show, which displayed the hidden stories of women performers and Black circus proprietors, also detailed Sheffield's important connections to circus. And this included connections to Pablo Frank, Britain's first Black circus owner, who married a Sheffield woman called Elizabeth Corker and settled here. Established circuses travelled on an international seasonal circuit throughout Britain, across Europe, with some like Barnum and Bailey coming from America. They followed traditional fairs, including the large Whitsun and Winter Fair in Sheffield. The general cemetery and the burials there show how Sheffield was an attractive place for circus proprietors and performers who set up more permanent, some of whom set up more permanent homes in Sheffield, with several circus performers and proprietors buried in the grounds. One of these is Romeo Quaglini. So in the Sheffield Independent newspaper of the 22nd of October, 1888, there is an advertisement for Quaglini's Grand Circus on Tudor Street, and Signor Romeo Quaglini is mentioned as the proprietor. An earlier article in 1871 entitled The Italian Cirque describes the circus as being a substantial looking wooden structure on a large piece of ground in Matilda Street. Romeo's father, Antonio Quaglini, known as Signor Quaglini, built and hosted his famous Grand Italian Cirque in the late 1860s. The circus building was built by Mr. John Spink of Ecclesall Sawmills, Oxford Road, and Brian D. Hillaby in the Lost Theatres of Sheffield describes Quaglini Circus as located at Barker's Pool on the corner of Burgess Street, which is now where the John Lewis store is sited. The Quaglinis had a specially built wooden tent, which employed 30 men and women, and I've got an image of the tent on this slide. You can see that it was a really quite impressive structure with a portico and nice decorative features and windows. So apart from stalls and boxes and a pit, there was a dress circle inside, carpeted with very cozy looking armchairs, and the building was brilliantly lighted by upwards of 470 gas jets. Signor Romeo continued his father Antonio's tradition of equestrian feats, including one on a barebacked horse. And I've got here one of the advertisements for the circus that was in the newspaper around the time, and you can see all of the different kinds of entertainment that were on. The Quaglini family were very large. They travelled the world. Romeo was born in 1840 in Italy, in the birthplace of his parents. Romeo also had 9 siblings who were born in various destinations all over the world, including France, Germany, and across the south of England. The family were all equestrian performers and pantomime performers. So equestrian acts required a deft performer to stand on the back of the horse and juggle or perform acrobatics. Romeo's act was to stand on a chair or sit on a chair on a horse and read a newspaper, while his brother Sebastian could hang off a horse from one knee. And I have a picture here of the Seurat's painting of the circus, which shows the equestrian artists doing some of these acrobatic feats on horses. The newspaper article also described 4 clowns, one of whom is described as a Shakespearean jester who said some very smart things in a manner that was remarkable for its freedom from anything like vulgarity, in a quote. In addition, there were performances on the trapeze, vaulting, and comic sketches. By 1901, Romeo had retired from the ring, and in the 1901 census, Romeo Quaglini is listed as a beer housekeeper from Italy, living and working at 90 Harvest Lane. He had a wife called Emma, who came from Norwich, and a daughter called Florence or Florrie. And he died in November 1903, aged 63 years, and there's no other burial in Romeo's grave. Through tales of performers like the Quaglinis, we get glimpses of the cultural milieu of Sheffield and Britain in this period of time. In the history of the theatrical culture of the city, we also get glimpses of who were celebrities at the time. who were these, who was famous in this Victorian age, and insight into what life as a performer might have been. One such celebrity was Samuel Morgan Smith. He was born on the 25th of March, 1833 in Philadelphia. And after training as an actor in Boston and New York, he came to England with his wife, Mary, and son, where he became an actor and manager of a small theatre in Gravesend. As a Black man, he was excluded from appearing in many theatres in America and had probably heard of the success of Ira Aldridge, another Black actor in Hull in England. Samuel became a famous Black tragedian. He played a number of Shakespearean and non-Shakespearean roles and was an outstanding success, but not a financial success. He became quite famous, but the season was a financial disaster. He next appeared in Birmingham and London in 1866, where he was hailed as a great triumph. Sadly, on the 6th of October, his wife Mary died of epilepsy at the age of 27. 2 years later, he went on to marry Harriet Goldspring in Glasgow during the spring of 1869. And they had a successful career touring all over England, Scotland, and Wales and performing together as Shakespearean couples. So I have here one of the advertisements for the Mr. and Mrs. Morgan Smith's Unique Drawing Room Entertainment, where they were doing different Shakespearean couples in this selection, Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. By 1882, he was living in retirement in Sheffield, and by now the family was extremely poor. Their income was only 8 shillings a week, earned by his son, and on the 16th of March, 1882, the Sheffield Telegraph reported him prostrated on his sickbed at Lowfield, with his wife making a gallant fight against starvation. He received aid from the Masons, of whom he was a member, but he died of pneumonia on the 22nd of March, 1882. His career was summed up in the following words. He was, as quoted, a superior performer, a talented and painstaking actor of intelligence, a careful elocutionist devoid of rant and exaggeration, whose personal and artistic life was governed by a sure sense of taste, good judgment, and proper deportment. So the cultural landscape of Sheffield was undoubtedly enhanced by these communities and people, and knowing about their lives helps us to understand what the cultural scene of the period was like and what people's experiences of it might have been. But turning back to the metalworking industries, there's such a rich history in Sheffield of people and communities such as Irish, Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Caribbean, Egyptian, Somalian communities, amongst many others, who came to Sheffield through the 20th century to work in the steel industry. What the burials in the cemetery show is that this history is much longer, that Sheffield has been a place where people from all over the world have built its industry for hundreds of years. We're looking to do more work on this with the Industrial Connections theme with the cemetery project. And I'm looking to work with some of the cemetery's neighbours at the ISRAC Centre in particular to link connections between the global Sheffield industry reflected in the burials at the cemetery and oral histories of Somalian seniors who worked in the steel industry in the 40s and 50s, showing this long legacy of experiences and the different strands of these really important contributions to Sheffield's industrial heritage. Many of those buried in the cemetery also display global networks of trade, where not only were people coming into Sheffield in industry, but so were goods and raw materials. I mentioned earlier the Moroccan leather made from skins imported from Nigeria and Guinea, and the stories of those who managed these trade routes, such as Henry Wharton, who died at sea off the coast of New Zealand, managing the development of the trade route of the Yorkshire Wire Works for the company in Australasia. These global trade routes were often drawn alongside colonial expansion as well, in which raw materials and resources from other countries were imported, and then goods were sent back out to be sold in colonized countries all over the world. These were also networks for people to move through as well. Professor David Olashoga writes in his book, Black and British, about the cotton triangle of the Victorian era, in which the cotton industry in the north of England, which employed a huge part of the population, was dependent on cotton coming from enslaved people in the plantations in America after Britain's abolition of slavery. This cotton was worked in Britain and then sent out against colonized countries such as India and other African nations. Professor Olashoga shows how mill workers at the time, whose suffering we often sympathize with in a retelling of the Industrial Revolution, themselves understood the plight of enslaved people who they knew had produced the cotton. Professor Olusoga argues that to fully understand the Industrial Revolution in Britain, all those often hidden global connections, people and relationships need to be shown as vital and integral parts of the history of Britain, not just tributaries. So although Sheffield was not obviously a major cotton producer, the same longer, more complex history of connections and global connections is a key part of understanding the industrial heritage of Sheffield, of goods produced, trade routes, wealth, and routes for people. The story of William Jumbo from the booklet hints at some of these experiences and the connections of these colonial expanding trade routes in the Victorian period in the wake of the transatlantic slave trade. William Jumbo was a man living on the Wicker in the mid-1800s who was recorded as coming from Africa. He died of apoplexy, which was the name given to different forms of internal bleeding, likely in William's case to be a stroke. He was buried in the cemetery in September of 1850, and I've shown here where we know he's buried, but like I said at the beginning, this is hidden history and the fact that there's no grave marker. As historians Professor Olusoga and Professor Olivette Otelli have written about, there are so many untold stories of African people in Europe for centuries, deeply intertwined and integral to what we think of as European history. And during the Victorian period, many people from Britain came to Britain from different countries in Africa and America and the Caribbean, seeking refuge from enslavement or because of ongoing subjugation. People came to settle, to study, or to find work, and they joined existing generations of Black British people already living here. Many were part of a colonial workforce in the Navy, Army, and other industries, subjected to ongoing colonial expansion into many countries in Africa during the 1800s. The legacy of this expansion and exploitation provided colonial countries like Britain with a continuing workforce and resources. And this ensured the ongoing increase of colonial markets, often at the expense of African nations. This also maintained trade and workforce routes for African nationals into Britain. And it's important to look at this history and think about what William's experiences might have been. William was living on the Wicker, which was adjacent to many workshops and sites of industry. His neighbours were cutlers, glaziers, and other metal workers, and it's really likely that William was employed in one of these trades. William may have been born in Liberia, as there's a record of a William Jambo, who was a 20-year-old native of Cape Palmas in Liberia, baptized in Liverpool in 1808. There are also quite a few instances of people with the surname Jumbo or Jambo in the British Navy during this period. There's one William Jambo from Sierra Leone, who was born in 1782 and named as working in the Navy in the 1830s, and another William Jumbo in the Navy, born in West Africa in 1834. Either of these could be our William ending up in Sheffield. Other people with this surname are recorded on passenger ships coming from that region, many from Liberia and Nigeria. His given name in these records may well have been a colonial misnomer. And these glimpses only provide supposition into William's possible experiences, and we hope that further research will help to provide more clues. I've got here the excerpt from the baptism record in Liverpool, which shows that one William Jambo from Cape Palmas off the coast of Africa. Another story of these global connections in the booklet is that of John Figurski, who displays how the industrial and metalworking industries were also incredibly important in experience of seeking asylum during this period. John Figurski died from influenza in 1912, aged 84. He's buried with his wife, Emma, who died in 1900, and 3 sons, 2 of whom died in infancy. Unusually, another unrelated adult, Valentine Gladish, is also interred in the grave. A retired cabinet casemaker, John Figurski, A retired cabinet casemaker, John Figurski was a member of the Wentworth Lodge of Freemasons, and for over 50 years was a member of the Upper Chapel. And for a time, he taught writing in the Pepper Alley schools on Sunday afternoons. However, the early part of John's life was really different. He was born in Russian Poland and descended from Polish aristocracy. And after the doomed Hungarian uprising against Austrian rule in 1848, many young Poles, including John, left to fight for the cause. According to his obituary in the Sheffield Daily Telegraph, the first challenge was to cross the Vistula into Austrian territory. When he finally made it to the other side after battling a strong current, he was discovered by fishermen who directed him to a friendly count who allowed John to stay with him for 3 days. After a short spell teaching in a village school, he joined the university volunteer corps and rode to Budapest, where he joined a Polish legion. John was one of the Polish lancers who, with two squadrons of Hungarian hussars, turned the tide of the Battle of Szkolnik. However, after the Battle of Temeshvar, where Hungarian forces were overwhelmed, he fled into Turkey. Wygorsky, like many others in the Legion, contracted typhus, and this spelt the end of his military career. He escaped to England and was at first dependent on charity. Now, at that moment in the period, refugees had an automatic right to asylum in 19th century Britain. But lots of activists concerned that the government would coerce exiles into leaving for America, organised committees to find these asylum seekers work. Sheffield's metalworking trades provided really good opportunities for these activists to supply labour to workshops and also to provide asylum seekers with a way to establish their lives here. Wygorsky was sent to Todmorden and became a blacksmith striker, earning 2 shillings 6 pence a week. After a period of being ill with brain fever, he came to Sheffield, where he found work as a scissor bow filer, working 15 to 16-hour days for at most 10 shillings a week. Eventually, he obtained work with John Round and Son, manufacturers of silver-plated ware, and as the obituary explains, he was still poor, but his education brought him into good, or wealthy, company, and he made the acquaintance of Miss Bell, daughter of the firm Bell and Sons, one of the first casemakers in the city. He married Miss Bell and entered the firm. He always yearned to see his relatives in Poland, but as a political exile, he was unable to return. Later in life, he did once more journey to the frontier and there exchanged final greetings with surviving family members. So that is a picture of John on the slide, and also a picture of the uprising that he was a part of, and his naturalization document. Less is known about the life of Valentin Gladish, who shares the grave. A death notice in the Sheffield Telegraph in December 1876 describes him as a Polish exile, member of the University of Lomberg, Austrian Poland, and much respected by all who knew him. He is remembered on the gravestone with the words, "a friend of the Wygorsky family." 7 years older than Joseph, he was unmarried and died relatively young at 55. Like Joseph, he was a military man, listed as a sub-lieutenant in the infantry, and in 1851, when he was living with more than 90 other Polish cavalry, infantry and artillery, he was living all at the same address in Liverpool. He almost certainly found work through the same activist initiatives that Wygorsky did. In 1861, Valentin was listed as a cutler, and in 1871, he was a spring knife cutler. During his leisure time, he wrote a book on penknives in Polish, which is now lost. The final story I'm going to tell today is a really short one, and it's the story of my own family in the Victorian period. As a strand of my maternal family, more than one strand, but one particular strand were incomers into Sheffield. One side were Jewish, by name of Weiss, who migrated from Belgium. They changed their name to Webster and converted to Christianity when they came to Sheffield and took up in the scythe-making industry. A member of the wealthy Turton family that I mentioned earlier, Thomas Turton, who was a steelmaker, is buried in the cemetery. And my great-great-grandmother, who was a Weiss or a Webster, formerly Weiss, married a son of this Turton family, who was then subsequently disowned. Family legend has it that great-great-grandma was a regular dancer on tables in pubs, and I like to think in one of Louis Metzger's music halls, perhaps, but that perhaps is wishful thinking. But my own fascination with Sheffield's history has always been deeply intertwined with the knowledge that it's people and their lives which make up what we think of as Sheffield's heritage. There are many strands and facets to it, and each should be held as important and given weight to understand the full picture. I hope today that I've given you a glimpse into the richness of the stories of the people buried at the cemetery, and I've told you a tale about how a key part of Sheffield's history is the global connections of the city and the people who lived here, stretching back hundreds of years. Thank you so much for listening to this talk today. If you want to learn more about any of this, please visit Sheffield General Cemetery Trust website, www.gensem.org, and get a copy of Incomers. There are loads more stories in the booklet, much like this, like the ones I've told today. We've also got lots of events coming up for the project with the lottery, and there are loads of ways to get involved with volunteering and trails that you can do around the cemetery that will let you explore more stories in your own time. thanks so much for joining me this afternoon. We've got some time now, I think, to have a look at some of the questions, if there are any from the chat. So I will have a look. Whoa. Share. So we have a question: what was the most surprising discovery you've made? That's such a great question. I think perhaps, I mean, they're all surprising in different ways. And I think one of the things that you find when you start looking into people's lives is just how rich people's lives are. I mean, everyone has different things happen to them. You know, John Fagorski's life, for example, was incredibly varied and had incredible experiences. And you know, finding William Jumbo and thinking about those connections, there's always something new. So I can't really say exactly what the most surprising thing is, but there's been some incredible things. Another question: was there an interesting pattern found throughout the research, e.g. nationalities? Well, so I've mentioned at the beginning, you know, huge influx of German families. There are loads more German families in the booklet. I think, you know, there are themes that come out. So there, you know, there are themes of asylum. There are different things that are connected to things that are happening nationally and internationally. Things like, you know, colonial trade routes that are not only, you know, bringing through raw resources and goods, but people, all of that expansion into a labor force. So there are definitely patterns that you start to kind of pick up and see, and themes that you can kind of see. And I think it'd be really interesting, you know, if you read the booklet, see, you know, kind of see what, because in the booklet the stories are left individually with not we wanted to just reconstruct people's lives and tell their stories. But it'd be really interesting to get, you know, feedback from people about what patterns people pick up on, and what analysis people might make. I don't know if there's any more questions. I don't know if Shirley, you want to comment at all. Oh, yeah. Did you use analysis software for your research? So you can get the basic research comes from, hi Shirley. The basic background research comes from the burial record. So there is a digital version, a database of the burial record, which you can purchase actually from Sheffield General Cemetery Trust. If you're interested in doing research as well, you know, get in touch about volunteering on burial research. But we are in the process of upgrading the kind of digital analysis software that's available to the researchers. So most of the analysis is done very, very meticulously by going through the archive, by going through documents, by doing searches. We use Ancestry and other things like Family Search to try and build census record information, but the richness that the history volunteers find is really from, you know, meticulous research of lots of different primary sources. But we are looking at how we can put in a lot more of the information that's been gathered over the years into something that would be into some software that would be more readily available as well to more people to do research. Shirley, what was the most exciting discovery or surprising discovery you've made?
We're talking about incomers.
Yeah.
I just found the story of John Fagorski really so dramatic and exciting on the one hand. On the other, what I found interesting was the German incomers who, I mean, there were a lot of pork butchers, but there were clockmakers and other people who came into the trades. And what was interesting about them was they all came over and they worked hard and they became naturalized British citizens. And very often they married Sheffield girls. And so their grandsons are Sheffield's accountants and lawyers, and and in a couple of cases, grandsons died in the First World War fighting on the the English side, the British side. So that I hadn't really thought about. I mean, I'm not from Sheffield, and I hadn't really thought about Sheffield being such a mix of people way back from the Victorian times. One interesting person we came across was a chap called his surname was Gautier, Gautier. He's not in the Incomers book, but he was the grandson of a Frenchman who married a girl from Hull. And I think they were in France during, time of great upheaval, and came here. And the man, his grandfather worked as a musician, and then 2 generations down, you have his grandson and great grandson, in fact, dying as a result of their service in the First World War. Those sort of things I find very interesting.
I think we found, didn't we, that I think what comes across is just that Sheffield seems to be a really
a mosaic,
a place where people felt like they could settle. We had people that had come to Hull or to Liverpool and then have found their way to Sheffield, and this is where they put down roots and built lives and made a home. And I think that's something that comes across in almost all the stories, which is really, really wonderful. Especially I think with like the circus performers who are performing all over the world, going all over the world, and then buying a house in Sheffield, or actually putting down a place to actually stay in Sheffield. So yeah, I think that's a really wonderful thing.
They all become Sheffieldians or Sheffordians, whatever the word is.
I don't know if there's any more questions, but we're almost, I think, out of time anyway. I'd like to thank you, Shirley, for coming along and answering some questions with me at the end. And if anyone has any more questions, please feel free to email. There's a contacts on www.gensem.org. Have a look at the events page on the website. Have a look at what's coming up. And thank you again to Migration Matters Festival for having us to do this talk. Please give feedback. If you would like to donate to the festival, that would be fantastic. It helps the festival continue. And please give feedback, because it helps, us know what, from my point of view, how to do a good talk and how to do a better talk next time. And yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Shirley, for coming along.